Hi everybody. In this module we're going to be focusing on leaf cuttings. In the introductory lecture to cuttings, you heard that some species can be asexually propagated from leaf cuttings. There are a limited number of species that can produce both adventitious roots and adventitious shoots, so leaf cutting techniques aren't used as frequently as stem cuttings, seed or tissue culture. But they're still used in some specialty nurseries for niche market crops, and it's good to have these methods in your toolbox of propagation techniques. By the end of this unit, you'll be able to name at least 3 plants that can be propagated from leaf cuttings, and describe how to propagate plants from partial leaves, whole leaf blades, and leaves with their petiole. Leaf cutting techniques can be divided into 3 main groups: leaves with their petiole attached, just the leaf blade, and leaf sections. In all these cases, in order to grow successfully, the leaf cells must be capable of de-differentiating into new areas of meristematic growth, where the actively dividing cells re-differentiate as root and shoot cells. Some leaf cuttings can produce adventitious roots, but can't produce adventitious shoots. A good example of this is the rubber plant, Ficus elastica, which you'll probably recognize as it's a common houseplant in North America and Western Europe. Cytokinins are a group of plant hormones which are influential in shoot production, in a somewhat similar way to auxins being influential in adventitious root production. Cytokinins can be applied to leaf cuttings to stimulate production of adventitious shoots, but this is rarely done in commercial nurseries. Leaf cutting techniques can be useful when there's a limited amount of propagation material available, or in the case of some succulents, when hundreds or even thousands of plants need to be grown. Another advantage of leaf cuttings is that in general, they don't need a large investment in specialized structures or equipment. In addition, many leaf cuttings are relatively simple to prepare, and you don't need as much expertise as some other methods of propagation, such as stem cuttings, grafting, or layering. One of the main disadvantages of leaf cuttings is that it can take a long time to produce a plant of marketable size, especially some of the succulents, which can be really slow growing, and for which customers are willing to pay a higher price for larger plants. For many of the rosette-forming succulents that self-propagate by producing offsets, it may be quicker to propagate them from divisions or separations, unless propagation material is limited. So let's look at the type of plants that we can grow from leaf cuttings. Most plants can't be grown from leaf cuttings. This includes most grasses, trees, shrubs, and herbaceous plants, although some of these can be grown from leaf cuttings by micropropagation techniques, which we'll talk about in another module on tissue culture. Plants we can grow from leaf cuttings using conventional macropropagation techniques include a small number of herbaceous plants and many plants with succulent and semi-succulent leaves. Rex begonias, Streptocarpus, and African violet are probably the top 3 groups of herbaceous plants, and certainly the most well-known, that are propagated commercially from leaf cuttings, although many of these are now grown from tissue culture. Some nurseries still produce many succulents from leaf cuttings. And before I talk about leaf cutting techniques, let's look a little more closely at some of the plants I just mentioned, so you know a little more about the plants, including what they look like, and you may recognize them when you see them in florists, nurseries, or supermarkets. Let's start with African violet. The botanical name for African violet was St. Paulia ionantha, but it was reclassified as Streptocarpus ionanthus in 2015 as the result of DNA analysis. African violet is native to Tanzania, and the specific epithet ionanthus means with violet-colored flowers. It's a low-growing, compact, herbaceous plant with dark green, hairy leaves that are thick and almost semi-succulent. Violet flowers are born in small panicles just above the foliage, and breeding has produced cultivars with blue violet, pink, fuchsia, and white flowers, plus double flowers and bicolored flowers. Trailing cultivars and miniatures are also available now. African violet was a really popular houseplant back in the 1960s and early 70s, but it's been enjoying a fashion resurgence in recent years. Plants kept in good growing condition can flower almost continuously. African violets are mostly propagated by tissue culture now, but some smaller specialty nurseries still grow them from leaf cuttings. Here are two more pictures of African violets, just giving you a small insight into the range of flower colors that are available. Streptocarpus is a genus of herbaceous perennials that are native to parts of Africa and Madagascar. And the genus is in the same family as African violet, the Gesneriaceae or the Gesneriads. Like the African violet, Streptocarpus was a popular houseplant back in the 70s, and it too has been making a comeback in recent years. Again, breeding work has widened the range of color flowers and growth habits available. Cape primroses form a rosette of long, strap-like, medium green leaves that are deeply veined. This slide shows a hybrid cultivar of Streptocarpus called lady slippers that has a particularly compact form and shorter flower stems, which make the plant appear much more floriferous. As mentioned earlier, breeding work has extended the range of flower colors and flower styles available in Streptocarpus. Here's a selection with bicolored double flowers. Rex begonias, or Begonia rex culturum, is a name applied to a group of cultivated, hybridized begonias, of which there are many. All the cultivated rex begonias include the wild species Begonia rex in their parentage, and you can see a drawing of the species on the right that was done by the famous British botanist William Hooker back in 1859. This rhizomatous perennial is native to rocky forested valleys and slopes in northeastern India, southern China, and Vietnam. The rex begonias available in nurseries and florists are all hybridized and cultivated with their showy foliage, which is often large with distinctive markings and colors in metallic pinks, bright greens, silvers, and purples. Some have distinctive snail shell or spiraled leaf forms, like the one in the middle of the photo on the near right. Because of their distinctive foliage, rex begonias are sometimes referred to as painted leaf begonias or fancy leaf begonias. Rex begonias are usually grown as houseplants or for interior landscaping in commercial buildings, or as annuals for lightly shaded areas outdoors. They can be overwintered and treated as perennials if they're brought indoors for the winter. They can be really fussy to grow. They prefer indirect light for the most part, and although they prefer high humidity, they rot easily if they're overwatered. The photo on the far right shows some of the stock plants used for propagation at Plantsmith Nursery in Oregon. The photo on the near right is a section of a vertical display of rex begonias at Blythewald Gardens near Newport in Rhode Island. The summers there are quite humid and ideal for outdoor displays of rex begonias. These last two photos of rex begonias are from Plantsmith Nursery in Oregon again, and show rex begonias planted with other shade-tolerant plants in a range of added value finished product containers marketed under the name Shady Chics. Added value products like this can be a good way of differentiating your business from others and a way of obtaining a higher profit margin. Carnivorous plants are probably one of the most fascinating groups of plants, with their leaf adaptations for trapping and digesting insects. Many of the popular carnivorous plants, such as Venus flytrap, are grown from seed or micropropagation techniques in a tissue culture lab. But several can be grown from leaf cuttings and some from stem cuttings. These conventional macropropagation techniques are particularly useful for smaller specialist nurseries who are growing a wide range of more unusual plants in relatively small numbers. The sundews, which are species of Drosera, are carnivorous plants that are most commonly propagated from leaf cuttings, and you can see two photos on the right of Drosera capensis at the top and Drosera rotundifolia at the bottom, which grows natively in California in boggy areas in the Sierra foothills. For those of you who'd like to know more about carnivorous plants, there's an excellent specialty nursery called California Carnivores up in Sebastopol, and a smaller specialist nursery in Half Moon Bay called Predatory Plants. The International Carnivorous Plant Society also has loads of good info on their website, and of course there are tons of videos on YouTube on how to produce carnivorous plants. Many succulents can be propagated from whole leaf cuttings and some from partial leaf cuttings. A lot of succulents self-propagate from leaves that break off. Examples include Sedum rubrotinctum, or pork and beans, and Sedum spathulifolium, or creeping stonecrop. The photo on the right shows flats of young succulents being propagated at Succulent Gardens, which is on Elkhorn Road on the east side of the Elkhorn Slough, just a few miles south of Watsonville. One of the best-known houseplants is mother-in-law's tongue, or snake plant. That's one of the few succulents that thrive indoors and in shade. It was formerly known as Sansevieria trifasciata, but was reclassified a few years ago in the genus Dracaena. Mother-in-law's tongue can be propagated from partial leaf cuttings, which I'll talk about in a minute. The photo on the right here shows the natural leaf coloring of this plant. And these two photos show two of the named selections available of mother-in-law's tongue. On the left is Harnii, which is a particularly compact form of mother-in-law's tongue, and on the right is Black Gold, which has particularly dark green leaves with broad yellow margins. Before talking about how to take leaf cuttings, let's review some basic external leaf anatomy so that you're all familiar with the terminology. The part of a leaf that's flattish, although not always, is referred to as the leaf blade or lamina. The leaf blade may be attached to the stem by a stalk called the petiole. Leaves that don't have a petiole and are attached directly to the stem are described as being sessile or sessile. At the center of the leaf blade is the midrib, which is an extension of the petiole and contains the vascular tissue, the xylem and phloem, and also provides some structural support for the leaf. Branching off the midrib is a network of veins which contain vascular tissue. Depending on the species, leaf cuttings can be done in three main ways. They can be done with the petiole attached, with just the leaf blade, or from cut sections of the leaf blade. The method that we use depends on the species, the amount of propagation material available, and the desired number of plants and the length of time you want to wait before the new plants are of marketable size or big enough to plant out in a landscape. The method that we choose can also depend on the type of container we want to grow the plants in, and of course in a commercial setting, the cost of production. For example, it may be more cost-effective to root cuttings in plug trays rather than in flats. The reason for this is that it's usually much quicker and there's less transplant shock to transplant cuttings from plugs rather than from flats. Some species may not be able to be propagated year-round from leaf cuttings. In a similar way to stem cuttings, there may be seasonality aspects to consider, as mentioned in the stem cuttings unit on juvenility and seasonality. Usually leaf cuttings are taken fairly early on in the growing season, so usually late spring through early summer. Leaves should be fully grown but still young. As with stem cuttings, leaves should be taken from healthy mother plants that aren't water or nutrient stressed and have no obvious pests or diseases. All the usual nursery hygiene practices that were discussed in an earlier module should be observed. And no rooting compound is usually necessary for leaf cuttings. Polarity is important for leaf cuttings in the same way that it is for stem cuttings and root cuttings. So leaf cuttings should be stuck the same way up as they were growing on the plant. As far as the substrate is concerned, choose a substrate that has good porosity and drains freely. Leaf cuttings can root really easily when the substrate's too wet, so keep it barely moist. 50% coir, which is coconut fiber, and 50% perlite is a good general purpose mix. It drains freely, has good porosity, and there are none of the wettability problems with coir that you can run into with peat. Remember to pay close attention to substrate moisture levels and humidity, as leaf cuttings are prone to rotting if the substrate's too wet. African violets in particular are prone to rotting if watered or misted overhead, or if the relative humidity is too high because the hairs on their leaves trap moisture. You should remove any decaying leaves promptly to reduce the risk of grey mold caused by the fungus botrytis. Botrytis is easily recognizable by fuzzy clouds of grey spores that it produces, and it's really common in propagation areas which are typically warm, moist, and humid, all conditions which really favor the growth of botrytis. The development of new plantlets will be slow at low temperatures, so aim to keep leaf cuttings at around 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Low light levels will result in poor growth. In the nursery, approximately 50% of ambient light is acceptable. At home, put the cuttings in a well-lit place, but protect them from direct sun. Leaf cuttings from herbaceous material benefit from relatively high humidity in order to limit water loss. At home, a plastic bag over the top of a container or a dome created by cutting a plastic bottle in half work well, or you can buy one of the domes that fit over a flat. In commercial nurseries, leaf cuttings are usually rooted under mist. Examples of plants that can be propagated using the leaf blade with the petiole attached are African violet, lobster flower, which is Plectranthus neochilus, and the large-leaved succulent Kalanchoe beharensis. In the photo here, you can see a leaf cutting of African violet that's rooted and is starting to produce a new plantlet at the base. The original leaf will eventually die, and it can be removed before that happens once the new plantlet is well established. Here are a couple of photos of a leaf cutting of lobster flower, Plectranthus neochilus. It shows a 3-week-old leaf cutting of lobster flower that's been removed from the plug tray so that you can see the roots forming. And on the right, the substrate's been rinsed off, and you can get a much better view of the roots. And you can see that after 3 weeks, there's still no obvious sign of any vegetative shoots being produced yet. Many succulents, especially species in the Crassula family, such as the sedums and many of the echeverias, can be propagated using just the leaf blade. In the garden, several of the sedums self-propagate by dropping leaves that then root. Some succulents root more successfully if you allow the cut area to dry out and heal before planting the cutting. This healing of the cut surface helps to prevent soil-borne pathogens infecting the cut and causing the leaf to rot. And the healing process can take several days to about 2 weeks. While many succulents root easily from leaf cuttings, this doesn't necessarily make this the best method of propagation. It can take a long time for a leaf cutting to grow into a plant of marketable size, so if cutting material isn't limited, it may be quicker to use stem cuttings or divisions or separation, which will be discussed in another module. A good example is the burrowtail sedum in the photo here. It can easily be propagated from leaf cuttings, but it would take years to produce a plant of this size from a single leaf, or even from several leaves. Several plants can be propagated using just sections of the leaf. They include Streptocarpus, Rex begonias, mother-in-law's tongue, Eucomis, and the carnivorous sundews. When you're cutting leaves into sections, remember that leaves have polarity in the same way as stems and roots, so make sure you remember which way is up. In the photo, you can see a leaf from mother-in-law's tongue being cut horizontally into sections about 2 to 2.5 inches long. These sections are then planted to about half their length in a freely draining porous substrate. And it'll take about 4 months to produce a plantlet about the size of the one in the photo on the right. Here you can see the sequence of events with mother-in-law's tongue. Roots are produced first along the cut edge at the proximal end of the leaf section. After about 4 months, plantlets that are big enough to be transplanted have grown. Let's talk now about Streptocarpus, the Cape primrose. I mentioned earlier that we should always select leaves that look healthy and leaves that are younger as well. So looking at this photo on the right here, we would probably not use this large leaf right here, but we'd go for this younger leaf right here that doesn't have any blemishes on it, and there are a few more leaves in the center of the rosette on this plant at the front that we could use. Streptocarpus is particularly interesting because its long strap-like leaves can be cut horizontally into sections like the mother-in-law's tongue, as shown in the top photo here. It can also be cut lengthways on both sides of the midrib, and then each half of the leaf can be planted horizontally to about 1/2 inch deep, and the midrib can be thrown away. Here are flats of partial leaf cuttings of Streptocarpus at Plantsmith Nursery in Oregon. Plantsmith is a specialist wholesale grower of Rex begonias and Streptocarpus and produces hundreds of thousands of liners of these two plants for shipping all over North America every year. Here you can see Streptocarpus leaf cuttings again at Plantsmith, but this time they're being rooted in ellie pots in plug trays. These cuttings are just a few days old. And once rooted in, the plug trays of young plants will be shipped to growers across North America. Ellie pots that I just mentioned are membranous tubes that are filled with a substrate of the grower's choice, and they're available in a variety of sizes. In the package of materials that you picked up at the beginning of the semester, there was an example of an Ellie tube with those materials so that you can see what it looks like. And here's the finished product at Plantsmith. These Streptocarpus plantlets are fully rooted in and ready to be shipped. So let's talk now a little bit about Rex begonias. Rex begonias can easily be rooted from whole leaf cuttings, but partial leaf cuttings are used in commercial nurseries because you can obtain many more plants. This photo is at Plantsmith again and shows thousands of new partial leaf cuttings of Rex begonias stuck in 72 cell plug trays. This photo also gives you an idea of the color range of Rex begonias. For more information on propagating Rex begonias from leaf cuttings, check out the additional unit on this topic in Canvas. Here's a closer look of those same leaf cuttings of Rex begonia at Plantsmith Nursery. So let's finish by summarizing the material covered in this unit. Many plants traditionally produced from leaf cuttings are now produced by tissue culture, but leaf cuttings remain a useful technique for some plants especially for specialty niche market nurseries. Leaf cuttings can be a useful method of propagation when propagation material is limited. They don't require sophisticated facilities or a high level of expertise. But the disadvantage of leaf cuttings is that it can be slow to produce a plant of marketable size, and it's also not a technique that works for a particularly wide range of plants. Usual nursery hygiene practices should be observed, and cuttings should be only taken from healthy mother plants. As with stem and root cuttings, polarity is important, so remember to keep cuttings the right way up. Some leaf cuttings are best taken at specific times of the year, so it's important to do some research first when working with leaf cuttings for the first time. There are three main techniques of taking leaf cuttings: the leaf blade plus petiole, just the leaf blade, or sections of the leaf blade. The method we choose depends mainly on the species and the amount of material available. Leaf cuttings should be stuck in a freely draining substrate and provided with an ambient temperature of around 65 degrees Fahrenheit and about 50% shade. The substrate should be lightly moist, but not wet, as leaf cuttings are prone to rotting. That's the end of this unit on leaf cuttings. Next, check out the unit in Canvas on propagating Rex begonias from leaf cuttings, and check your knowledge of this topic by taking the leaf cuttings quiz.